Another week has come to an end and we finally get to see how our favorite movies are doing financially. On this show, we break down the domestic weekend performers, how big the films are playing on a global scale, and what blockbusters have become successful, and which ones have fallen flat on their faces. We have a lot to talk about, so let's tear this thing open and see what's cooking. Opening at number 1, unsurprisingly, The Flash took the top spot in its debut weekend with $55.10 million. What is surprising, however, that is substantially lower than even the low end of last week's expectations of $72 to $105 million. This is a textbook example of how you can finish in first place and still be a big loser. In second place in its debut weekend, Elemental has grossed a shockingly low $29.5 million, which again comes in on the lower end of expectations, which were $31 to $41 million. There is a lot to talk about with this one once we crunch the numbers, so we'll see how bad it's truly performing in a minute. In third place is Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse with another solid $27.8 million in its third weekend, taking a 49.9% drop. In fourth place in only its second weekend is Transformers Rise of the Beast with a disappointing $20 million, dropping a substantial 67.2%. Although it's not all doom and gloom for the Transformers, and we'll get into that in a minute as well. Rounding out the top 5 is The Little Mermaid in its fourth weekend, dropping 49.9% for an $11.60 million haul. As always, these numbers could possibly change, and if they do, I will pin the box office actuals in the comments down below. Now let's move on to check on how some of the bigger blockbusters are doing at the worldwide box office. Just so you know, I only qualify films that have big budgets for these next two categories of the report. So far in its first weekend, The Flash has grossed a poor $139 million worldwide. Also in its first weekend, doing even worse is Elemental, which only grossed $44.50 million worldwide. Transformers Rise of the Beast, on the other hand, is performing decently well, with $278 million after 10 days. Doing even better is Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, which after 16 days has grossed $494 million, predominantly from domestic markets. The Little Mermaid is doing less than ideal after 23 days with $467.70 million on the global scale. Fast X is still chugging right along with $676.94 million after a full 30 days in release. And for the last time on this show, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, after 44 days and winding down its global run, has grossed an epic $821.61 million at the worldwide box office. Over the last 45 days, these films have grossed a whopping $2.922 billion in ticket sales across the globe. Moving on to our profitability calculator, I've done a bunch of research and have created a formula for estimating the profit margin of blockbuster films. Movie studios don't get all the revenue back. In fact, they only get 2/3 of the domestic take, and across the rest of the world, the take is only around 45%. How we calculate profitability is we combine the production budget with the advertising costs. Advertising is hard to find numbers on, so if nothing is reported, it's usually half of the production budget but not greater than $100 million. We then compare the total spend with the studio take, and the sum of this determines the ROI, which is return on investment. First off is Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, having a reported budget of $250 million and a reported marketing spend of around $100 million. That costs a whopping $350 million. Worldwide, the film has grossed $821.61 million. Domestically, the film has grossed $345.11 million, so the actual take is $227.77 million. Internationally, the film has grossed $476.50 million, bringing the take down to $214.43 million. That brings our global take to $442.20 million, and against a $350 million spend, the return on investment is $92.20 million for Marvel Studios. This is the last week for Guardians of the Galaxy in the profitability calculator, having passed its 45-day run. The film will continue to thrive in home media markets for the rest of its lifetime, continuing its success. Fast X also had an absurd budget thanks to massive production issues, inflating its budget to $340 million, and reportedly costing around $100 million to market. That's an insane $440 million spend. So far, the film has grossed $676.94 million worldwide. Domestically, the film has grossed $142.72 million, so the actual take is $94.20 million from that market. Internationally, the film has grossed $534.22 million, bringing the take down to $240.40 million. That brings our global take to $334.60 million, and against a $440 million spend, the return on investment is negative $105.4 million for Universal Studios. It still has another couple weeks in the international markets, but the domestic total is pretty much finished because it is now on home media markets. We will see where this film is in the next couple of weeks, but it looks like Fast X will be a money loser in the theatrical markets. As for The Little Mermaid, it had a massive production budget of $250 million and a marketing budget of a whopping $150 million. Usually that amount on marketing is pretty rare, but that's the number that is being reported, so that's the number we are going to go with. That brings the spend up to $400 million. So far, the film has grossed $467.70 million worldwide. Domestically, the film has grossed $255.30 million, so the actual take is $168.5 million from that market. The Little Mermaid is not playing well overseas. Internationally, the film has grossed $212.40 million, bringing the take down to $95.58 million. That brings our global take to $264.08 million, and against a $400 million spend, the return on investment is negative $135.92 million for Disney Studios. With the competitive market, the film is really starting to lose steam and will most likely end its run as a money loser. Things are looking much better for Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, which has a reported budget of $100 million and approximately another $50 million in marketing, with a total spend of $150 million. So far, the film has grossed $494 million worldwide. Domestically, the film has grossed an impressive $285 million, so the actual take is $188.10 million from that market. However, Spider-Man is also not playing well overseas. Internationally, the film has grossed $209 million, bringing the take down to $94.05 million. That brings our global take to $282.15 million, and against a $150 million spend, the return on investment is $132.15 million for Sony Pictures. Only 3 weeks in, the film is already an impressive box office success. Transformers: Rise of the Beasts is also performing quite well in this crowded market, with a reported budget of $195 million and going off our current model that puts an approximate marketing budget of around $98 million. That brings the spend to around $293 million. So far, the film has grossed $278 million worldwide. Domestically, the film has grossed a soft $103.7 million, so the actual take is $68.44 million from that market. Transformers is playing pretty solid overseas. Internationally, the film has grossed $174.3 million, bringing the take down to $78.44 million. That brings our global take to $146.88 million, and against a $293 million spend, the return on investment is negative $146.12 million for Paramount Pictures. Granted, most films are still in the red after only 2 weeks, and thankfully, after just 10 days, the film is already halfway there to making a profit in its theatrical run, which I think it will do. We will see how it performs in the weeks ahead, and based off of the solid audience reception, I believe it has a healthy run ahead of it. Elemental, unfortunately, is a totally different story, with a reported budget of $200 million, and going off our current model puts an approximate marketing budget of around $100 million. That brings the spend to around $300 million. So far, the film has grossed a tragically pathetic $44.5 million worldwide. Domestically, the film has grossed $29.5 million, so the actual take is $19.47 million from that market. Internationally, the film has grossed only $15 million, bringing the take down to just $6.75 million. That brings our global take to $26.22 million, and against a $300 million spend, the return on investment is negative $273.78 million for Pixar Animation Studios. It's only been out for 1 weekend, but this is very, very bad. If these low box office trends continue, Elemental may be the biggest box office bomb of the year. Moving on to newcomer The Flash, things are also looking pretty terrible here too. With a reported budget of $220 million and another reported $110 million in marketing, that brings the total spend to around $330 million. So far, the film has grossed only $139 million worldwide. Domestically, the film has grossed $55.10 million, so the actual take is $36.37 million from that market. Internationally, the film has grossed $83.9 million, bringing the take down to $37.76 million. That brings our global take to $74.76 million, and against a $330 million spend, the return on investment is negative $255.87 million for Warner Brothers. This could be a weird day in film history, where two of the year's biggest blockbusters opened on the same day and might both end up being the year's biggest box office bombs. Unlike Elemental, however, The Flash is not being received well with general audiences, so I expect to see some massive week 2 drops for this film. Next weekend, we have the release of the R-rated comedy No Hard Feelings starring Jennifer Lawrence, and it is currently tracking for a $10 to $15 million debut, providing what should be good counter-programming from all these blockbusters, and perhaps giving a week-long buffer from another blockbuster so they can have easier week-to-week drops. Something we will definitely be looking into in next week's box office report. Thanks for checking out the video. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking, subscribing, and sticking around. I do movie reviews and box office reports every single week, so if you don't want to miss that, you know what to do.